Well, hello, my curious ones, and welcome back to this week's show. I am your show host, SHETAN NOIR, and this is High Strangeness in the Liminal Abyss. So, we are now in the middle of November, and the gales of November have started across the Great Lakes. Now, as I've talked about in the previous episodes, the gales are huge storm fronts that come across the Great Lakes, and because they are such open expanses, there's really nothing that stops the wind and the waves from building in momentum until they crash into either a ship or a shoreline. And this is what we see on all five of our Great Lakes: Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Superior, especially Lake Superior. She's huge. Um, this is a factor in all of them. And I was just watching a really good television show last night. It was actually on YouTube, being broadcast, but it was originally aired a couple of months ago on PBS. I could never find it on PBS. Either it wasn't playing at the time that I was looking for it, or just wasn't available, but they finally have uploaded it onto YouTube. And the episode discusses finding shipwrecks on the bottom of the Great Lakes. And it's actually called Ghost Ships of the Great Lakes. Really good episode. I highly recommend it. There's two different segments. One where Rick Mixer and the team from the Great Lakes Museum, Maritime Museum, they go looking for three schooner barges that sank during a storm on Lake Superior. And they found the Melvin, and we're still looking for the Peterson. And they found one of the other one. What was the other one? That's really bad. I cannot remember the other one, but they found two of them. They could not find the third one. And they all were attached to one another, which was a thing that they did back in the 1800s. They would take a 6-inch tow line and they would attach one or two ships together, maybe three at the most. And your strongest ship would be the lead ship. And then you would have 100-foot length of this 6-inch wide tow rope pulling the other ships along, and it would be attached to the front of the second boat, and then there would be a line going out the bow of the second boat to the next boat, the third one behind it. And the problem with this is, as you're going over the hills and valleys of the waves, the ridges and the troughs, so to speak, your ropes during that time period were not built for this kind of tug and release type action, especially when the ropes themselves were being exposed to freezing cold water, were constantly wet, and especially in storms. What would happen is, at some point, if one of the ships started sinking, they would have to sever that tow line. And if the tow line between the first and second ship broke, that meant that the second and third ship were left to their own demise. And if they didn't have proper working engines, this was a real problem. If they only had sails, they might only be able to put up one sail after severing all lines to navigate to maybe the nearest land formation. And if you're turned and spun around in the Great Lakes and you don't know where those landmarks are, you're pretty much at the mercy of lake, storms. Now, the second part of the episode was in Lake Michigan and talked about the two ships, a wooden steamer ship, I believe it was the Dobby, and it was pulling a ship, the Olive Jeanette, which was a sail ship, a schooner. Now, the thing that's interesting about the Olive Jeanette was the cook. This was a female cook, and she would be on several different ships that sank. The first one, she was caught in the storm action, and she was on the Olive Jeanette, which was being towed by the Dobby. Now, the Dobby was the more powerful ship, but it was a wooden ship, steamer ship, and was being towed once again by a 6-inch tow rope, and was experiencing the exact same type of storm activity. The only problem is, even though the Dobby was a newer ship, it started to fail. And the cook was watching this in horror, and she watched as the tow rope broke, which left the Olive Jeanette to fend for herself. So the sailors quickly put up sails and were able to navigate back into port, which the storm was so powerful that it essentially sent the Olive Jeanette right back to the port that she had been towed out of following the Dobby. Now, the cook, I believe her name was Julie Waters. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Don't hold me on that one. She would be on a second ship, and this ship unfortunately would sink and take all hands with it. And the reason we know that she was on this ship was 100 years later, fishermen were dragging their nets through the lake to haul up fish, and they caught on something. And so they increased the tension on the toe of the nets, and they pulled it up, and as they were hauling out the fish, they found a human skull. But they also found pieces of the mast. So the assumption was, as the ship was sinking and they were hoping that they could navigate towards land, everybody would take to the highest point of the ship, which would be the mast. And they're assuming that that's where she was, and that's how the nets caught her skull and pulled it up. And it took quite a bit of research to realize that, because it was not uncommon for sailors or crew members of a ship that if it sank or if it had any type of curse on it or hoodoo on it, hoodoo being not the magic hoodoo, but hoodoo meaning that it was considered bad luck. The ship was considered bad luck. So any ships that survived a really bad storm and everybody said, oh, that ship should have sank, or any ships that sank to the bottom but the crew was rescued, generally they kind of had a stigma against them, and almost like a curse was put on them that, because they survived one wreck, they would probably be on another wreck and would, send the ship to the bottom. So it was not uncommon for crew members to change their names, because really back in the 1800s, there was no qualifications or application process. You showed up, you were hired, you got on the ship, you did your job. And so there's various accounts of her talking to newspapers and giving them her eyewitness testimony of what she witnessed in a shipwreck or storms or whatever. And she would always say she was a cook on the ship, which was kind of uncommon for women to be allowed on ships, but a cook was probably an acceptable role. Um, if it wasn't the captain's wife being the cook, then they'd hire whoever for a cook as long as they could make a good meal. They were hired. So we know on several different occasions she gave an anonymous name to newspapers in accordance to what ship she was on. But we do know that she was on two different ships. The first one, the Olive Jeanette, made back into port. The second one sank with all hands, and she went down with it. Now, this is probably something that I'm going to research more, because I think it would make a very interesting either presentation or book of women on the Great Lakes who either went above and beyond to try to help, which I will talk about a very unique woman next week who was called an angel because she saved so many people from drowning on the Great Lakes. But she would be a prominent feature in this book. But I think this cook, Julie Waters from the Olive Jeanette, I think she's a very interesting person because the mysteriousness of it, of her feeling that she needed to change her name and hide who she was, what ship she was from. Because while that might have made a difference with the everyday person that she was encountering and working with, especially if people from the former ship went to other ships and nobody knew her, recognized her, if she went to a different port, got work at a different port, probably nobody was ever going to know that she had been on this ship or on another ship. But it's said that the deities that rule the water, Poseidon, Inubishu, the great Nibinibus, or the great Manitou Nibinibus, they know what ships went to the bottom. They know all the souls who are spared on ships that make it back into port. And so while she might have been able to fool other humans, certainly the gods of the lakes, the gods of the water, the great underwater panther, all knew who she was. And it might have only been a matter of time, a matter of ships, before she was caught on the wrong one during a storm and it began to sink. So there's so many interesting stories and legends and true facts about the Great Lakes. And I'm hoping you guys are enjoying the content, because I really enjoy talking about stuff around the Great Lakes. Those 5 bodies of water have always been very mysterious and very alluring. And who knows what all lurks in their depths. Certainly, we will never know, because the Great Lakes will never, ever be drained unless a huge earthquake or something comes through the Great Lakes area. But I think California has that covered. So tune in next week as I talk about more interesting figures from the Great Lakes maritime history. And until then, stay curious out there and keep exploring this mysterious world.